My name is Pat Crisosimo, and this summer I've been working on the lab in UCSD. Basically, my job has been to isolate plasmid DNA for injections for mice, that is. I'm a double major at Stanford, or at least I hope to be at this point. I'm undeclared. So I'm majoring in bio, and eventually I want to go to med school. So volunteering at a med school at a laboratory seems like a good idea, and I've actually learned a phenomenal amount. I went into it knowing ground zero about molecular bio, and now I've learned a lot this summer. And so my job is to make DNA basically, and in order to make DNA, I need to go through two major steps. The first step is growing up the bugs or bacteria, and the second step is going through a process which breaks down the bugs, breaks down the bacteria, breaks down the cell wall, and removes the proteins, and then isolate the DNA from that. So what I'm going to describe is how to start a culture of DNA, start a small culture of DNA called inoculation. The first thing I need to do is I need to figure out what number the plasmid is. For example, my boss told me that I have to make a culture of NCMV B71 tomorrow. So in order for that, I need to grow the bugs overnight. And so I go into her catalog of DNA, and then the number for in CMV B71 is 32. I need to remember that number because when I go into the freezer, there's a lot of DNA in little tubes with certain numbers on them. Rather than wasting my time looking for looking on the labels of all of the tubes, I just look on the labels at the top and I just remember the number 32. So the first thing that Delphine taught me was to label everything. So I get a piece of colored tape and I write the number 32. I need three things on when you label: the name of what it is, the date, and your initials. So I put number 32 in CMV V71, the date 8/21/96, and PC are my initials. And I stick the color 2 on a 3 ml is milliliter. Actually, I get a 10 ml culture tube, and I'll quat 3 mils of LB into it. And LB is Loria broth, and LB is the medium in which the culture grow, the bugs grow. And I'll quat 3 mils of LB into a culture tube. In order to outquat that amount, we have to be precise. So we have a tool called the pipette aid, and it's sort of a suction thing. In chemistry, you use bulbs, but this is more of a mechanic thing. So we stick the pipette into the pipette aid and suction up 3 mils of LB, and then we put 3 mils of LB into the culture tube. And after that, I need this plasmid has to be epsilon resistant. So we go into the freezer, and so in my box I have a little tube of A100, and A100 stands for absolute 100 milligram per milliliter. And so since this is frozen, I have to take the absolute out of the freezer and put it on the heat block in order to thaw, because you can't remove things out of the freezer. You can't pipette out of something that is frozen. So I put it on the heat block, and once it's thawed, I get a different thing called a pipette mint, which is blue, and we use it to pipette different small amounts of. So I pipette 3 microliters, which we call them 3 lambda. Written is called lambda, and that's the Greek letter. So we pipette 3 lambda of thawed epsilon and alquat that and inject that into 3 mils of LB. And so now any bacteria or bugs that grow into this LB will be epsilon resistant. And then I make sure to put that back in the freezer because that needs to be frozen and it can't be left outside. And so after that's ready, I make sure the cap is on and the label's on. make sure everything's okay, and then I need to go into the freezer room in order to get my bugs. So now that the media is ready and the culture tube is ready and everything is labeled, I go into the freezer room and the bacteria is stored at negative 83 degrees Celsius. And I make sure before I start that I always have my gloves on because these things are biohazardous. So I take my tray where I have my 10 ml culture tube, and I take my pipette min, a box of pipe tips, and also, and that's it. And then I go into the freezer room and I open the negative 83-degree freezer and I pull out the box, the D box where the bacteria is stored. And then I pull out the box and then I look for number 32. And then I take out my little tube, which has number 32 on it, and I put the rest of the box. I close up the box and put it back in the freezer because you don't want all the other things to be thawed out at once. And so you make sure to close that. And so now I have my pipette and my box of pipette tips. And so I scrape a little bit. Using my pipette tip, I scrape a little bit of the NCMV B71 with the end of my tip and put a little chunk of that into the 3 mils of LB lamp. And so I put that in there, and I pipe it up and I pipe it down to make sure I get anything that might have been stuck in a pipette. And if the glycerol stock has been or is too frozen and you can't isolate a chunk, you remove. Then you take out some of the LB and pipe it up and squirt some of that room temperature LB into the frozen glycerol stock in order to soften it. So you have sort of a slushy mush. And so then you can remove some of the bacteria that is frozen since it's softened. And then you can remove a chunk of it from there. And once you've done that, you scrape a little bit and then you put that into the LB amp and you twist the cover back on and put it back into the negative 83 freezer and so that it chills a little bit. So you put it back to make sure nothing else is thawed. And once you have that into solution, since they defrost very easily, since you have your bugs in solution, you make sure to dispose of your pipette tip in a biohazardous waste because it's biohazardous and you don't want anything else to be growing out of there. And then you take the 3 ml culture tube, and that's labeled, and you put it into the shaker room. And the shaker room is where the bugs will grow overnight, but I'm doing a small culture. So first of all, you need to turn down the shaker so that it's not turning so fast. So then you turn it down, and you wait for it to come to a complete stop. And after that, you put the 10 ml culture tube on the shaker, and then you turn it up, and then you close the door. It's kept at 37 degrees, and you make sure that the shaker comes on again because a lot of people have different stuff growing in there. And after that, after it's done, you let it incubate for 6 to 7 hours or however long you're working there, and you need to inoculate a big culture. And right before you leave, you take the small culture. You have 3 mils, and then you take the small culture and separate that.